Sometimes it starts at 3 a.m. Your mind is already running. Before you're even fully awake, the same thoughts, the same what-ifs, looping again and again. And suddenly, it feels like you're trapped inside your own head. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." And in moments like this, your mind becomes a battlefield. But here's what most people never realize. The real struggle isn't your life. It's your thoughts about your life. In this video, we're not trying to fix the outside. We're returning to something deeper, a quiet place inside you that was never lost, only forgotten. 1. Your thoughts don't always tell the truth. There's an old comparison, the mind to a monkey, leaping branch to branch, never quite settling. It's a simple image, but sit with it for a second. That restlessness, that constant motion from one worry to the next, that's familiar to most people. When things get hard, the mind gets louder, and it gets more convincing. You start hearing things in your own voice, things like, "I'm not going to come out of this okay. There's no way through this. I've already failed." It feels like information. It feels like assessment. But it's not always that. A thought is a pattern, something the brain has rehearsed, often over years, often rooted in old fear rather than what's actually in front of you right now. Thinking something doesn't make it true. Feeling something strongly doesn't make it accurate. The two get confused constantly. There's a practice that's been around for centuries, just watching thoughts, not fighting them, not arguing with them, just noticing them from a little bit of distance. Picture yourself sitting near a river. The water moves, leaves drift past. You're not trying to stop any of it. You're just there on the bank watching. That's the position. The thoughts keep coming, but you're not swept into every single one. Some people describe it as watching weather. Dark clouds, lighter ones, the occasional storm. None of it is permanent. And none of it is you. You're what's underneath, the awareness that's present regardless of what's moving through. When a heavy thought arrives, the kind that insists you're in real trouble, that things won't work out, that you're not enough, there's a way to meet it without immediately buying into it. That's a thought, it's passing through. It's not the final word, that's not denial. It's not pretending the feeling isn't there. It's just creating a little room between what arrives and how you respond to it. Over time, that room gets a little bigger. And the thoughts that used to feel like certainties start feeling more like weather, real while they're here, but moving. 2. The future isn't a place you're actually in. A lot of the suffering that lives in worry isn't about what's happening. It's about what might happen, what could go wrong, what might be coming. What if this doesn't work? What if I can't handle it? What if things fall apart further? The mind runs those scenarios like they're already real. And the body responds like they are, tightening, bracing, preparing for impact on something that hasn't come yet and may never arrive. Most of what we worry about doesn't happen. Most of the specific things, the imagined conversations go differently. The feared outcomes either don't show up or don't look the way we pictured. We spend enormous amounts of energy living inside events that exist only as projection. The present moment is different. It's actual. Whatever is happening right now, this breath, this room, this body, that's not a projection. It's not a forecast, it's just what is. And in this moment, usually you're okay, breathing, still here. There are basic ways of doing this, nothing complicated. Paying attention to your breath, listening to whatever sounds are in the room. Feeling where your body makes contact with whatever surface is holding you. These aren't tricks. They're just ways of bringing attention back from the imagined future into the actual present. When the mind starts running its scenarios, there's a question worth asking. What's actually happening right now? Not in an hour, not tomorrow, right now. In this moment, is there something that requires my attention? Often the answer is no. Often what requires your attention is the worry itself, not anything real in front of you. The next step doesn't need to be solved from here. The whole path doesn't need to be visible. What's available is this moment, this breath, and whatever comes directly from that. That's not a limitation. That's actually enough to move forward from. 3. Some things are yours to decide, others aren't. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to manage everything. Wanting circumstances to behave, wanting outcomes to match plans, wanting people to respond the way you need them to. It's an enormous amount of energy directed at things that aren't fully available to be controlled. Life doesn't negotiate much. Situations shift. People act from their own interior worlds. Plans encounter the real world and change shape. And every time something doesn't obey the version of events we had in mind, there's that spike, frustration, fear, helplessness. The tighter the grip, the more that slips through. Holding onto something with force doesn't keep it, it sometimes pushes it away faster. What's actually available to you is different. It's smaller in some ways and much more powerful in others. Your breath, your next choice, the way you respond when something unexpected happens, whether you pause or immediately react. Whether you meet a difficult conversation with a clenched jaw or something steadier. Your attention, where you direct it, how long you stay with something when you let it go. That's the territory. And within that territory, there's a lot of room. When someone says something that stings, you can breathe before you answer. When a plan dissolves, you can wait a beat before deciding what it means. When uncertainty crowds in, you can choose which direction to turn your attention, toward what's falling apart or toward what's still standing. There's a word for this kind of internal steadiness, equanimity. It doesn't mean indifference. It doesn't mean nothing touches you. It means something stays level even when things are rough. Like a ship in weather, the water is real, the wind is real, but the ship maintains its orientation. That's not passive. That's actually a very active thing. Choosing your response again and again is a form of presence. It's not controlling the outcome. It's showing up to whatever outcome arrives with something intact. And gradually, that becomes the ground you stand on, not the circumstances, not what other people decide. Something inside that you've been building by practicing these small choices. The worry begins to loosen its hold, not because things got easier, but because you stopped needing them to be different in order to feel okay. 4. The hard days weren't only damage. It's almost automatic, looking back at painful times and wishing they hadn't happened. The losses, the failures, the seasons that felt like they had no floor. You'd undo them if you could. Of course you would, but there's something else also true about those periods. A seed moving through dark soil has to push against real resistance. It has to crack. The pressure that feels like it's crushing the thing is also the thing that generates movement. Without the constraint, there's no upward direction. The difficulty is part of the mechanism. That's not a comfortable framing. It doesn't make hard things easier while they're happening. But looking back, the times that shaped you most were rarely the comfortable ones. When you stayed with something painful instead of running from it, you learned something about your own capacity. When you faced grief or failure or something you didn't see coming and you still kept going, you discovered that you could. Compassion came from knowing what it feels like to hurt. That's not abstract. It's the direct result of having been through something. There's a phrase for this, turning poison into medicine. It's not about pretending the poison wasn't poison. It's about what becomes possible when something harmful is met with enough presence and enough honesty to be transformed into something that helps. What the hard chapters gave you, the understanding, the depth, the capacity to sit with difficulty, those were built in the difficulty. They're not separate from it. They emerged from it. Looking back at those times doesn't have to mean regret. It can mean something closer to acknowledgement. It happened. It was real. It built something in you that couldn't have come from anywhere easier. 5. Not everything that arrives needs a response. When the mind is already carrying stress, even small things get amplified. A careless comment lands differently than it would on a settled day. A minor inconvenience feels significant. The inner critic finds material in small mistakes and builds something disproportionate from them, and the pull to react is fast. Before you've even quite processed what happened, there's already a response forming. Think of a still body of water. A stone dropped in it creates ripples that move outward and then settle. But if the surface is already disturbed, even a small stone makes waves that don't resolve quickly, that collide with other waves and grow. The internal equivalent is similar. When there's already a lot of tension present, things that would otherwise pass without much effect instead ignite something larger. The practice isn't to stop feeling things. It's to widen the gap between what arrives and how you meet it. Someone says something critical. There's a sensation, a tightening, a heat, the impulse to push back or collapse. But you don't have to act on the first wave of that. You can notice it. There's the impulse, and then there's a breath, and then there's a choice. Sometimes the honest assessment is, this doesn't actually need my response. Sometimes the words someone said were more about what they're carrying than about you. Sometimes the frustrating thing that happened is genuinely minor and will be irrelevant in a few hours. Not everything deserves the full weight of your attention. Not every passing disturbance requires a position. Not every critical thought your own mind produces is something to argue with or act on. The inner voice that says you're not good enough, you should have done that differently, you're behind, that voice doesn't hold final authority. Noticing it without reacting to it is its own kind of practice. You see it. You don't follow it into every room it wants to enter. This builds slowly. It starts with small moments, a small irritation met with a breath instead of tension. Over time, those small moments add up, and what develops is something like a steadier center. Not unmoved, but not constantly swept along either. The things worth your attention become clearer. And the things that aren't, they start to fall away more naturally, without requiring you to push them out. 6. What feels like a wall might be a different kind of door. When something hard is happening, a relationship ending, work falling apart, something you built not working out, the mind tends toward one framing. This is a problem to solve or a threat to survive. That's not wrong, but it's not the only way to hold it. There's an image worth sitting with. You're walking a path and something is blocking it. A fallen tree, let's say. The first response might be frustration or defeat. The path is blocked. The journey is over. But if you walk along the obstacle instead of stopping in front of it, sometimes you find the gap. And through the gap, sometimes, you see something you never would have noticed from the original path. A stream, different light coming through the trees, ground you didn't know was there. The obstacle and the new path aren't separate. The obstacle is what redirected you toward the new path. The pain is there. The difficulty is real. But within the difficulty, there are questions worth asking. What is this asking of me? What might be becoming visible here that wasn't before? What did I assume about this situation that I'm now having to release? Sometimes a struggle surfaces exactly where a belief was rigid and needed room to breathe. Where you were clinging to an outcome so specifically that you couldn't see any other. When the specific outcome falls away, sometimes something opens. Sitting with a problem long enough to let it teach you something is different from being paralyzed by it. The first requires some trust, not necessarily that everything will be fine, but that there is something here to understand and that understanding it will matter. Life is impermanent. The current difficulty will not be permanent. Neither will the clarity that sometimes follows it. But both of those things are real and both of them pass. You are not a victim of the difficulty. You are someone moving through it, and what you learn in the moving is real and yours. 7. Fear often dissolves into something else when met directly. Fear tends to live in the uncertain spaces, the not yet known, the edge of the forest where you can't see what's inside. The mind fills that space with its worst projections. What if I fail? What if my situation gets worse? What if I can't manage this? The projections feel more certain than the actual future, which of course hasn't happened. There's something different from certainty that can coexist with that fear. Not a guarantee, not a promise that things will resolve the way you want. Something quieter, a kind of trust that you've been here before, in uncertain territory, and something in you kept moving. Think of moments in your own life when things were difficult and unclear, and you couldn't see the way through, and somehow you found one anyway. Not necessarily the way you'd planned, but a way. You had access to something, resilience, or help that arrived, or a decision that surprised you, or simply the capacity to persist. Those moments are evidence, not of guaranteed outcomes, but of something in you that is available when it's needed. Impermanence cuts in both directions. The hard thing changes too. Emotions move. Situations shift. The certainty you feel about how bad things are, that also changes. Nothing that feels fixed stays exactly fixed. When fear arrives, it doesn't have to be met as an enemy. It can be looked at more closely. What is this actually pointing to? What is underneath this? Often, beneath the fear is something more specific, an attachment, an assumption, something that matters deeply and feels under threat. Seeing that clearly is different from being overwhelmed by it. It gives you something to actually work with, and then the next breath, and the one after that, not the whole future, just what's in reach right now, that's enough to move from. 7 observations, not a prescription, not a set of steps towards some promised outcome. Just things that have been noticed about how the mind moves and what happens when you meet it differently. Worry still arises. Uncertainty is real. Hard things remain hard. But you don't have to be at the mercy of all of it.